But there's nothing in the Constitution that prohibits someone from serving a third term. Well, how could somebody serve a third term but not be elected to it? The idea was floated last summer that perhaps Barack Obama would run for VP. And then the president resigns and automatically the vice president becomes the president. Lo and behold, you have a third term. And there was a lot of speculation that Joe Biden was not up to the task, that, what if he stepped down and Kamala assumed the presidency? Could she run for 2 more terms or just 1 more term? And of course, the same law professors who said that was perfectly fine when Obama was going to do it will now announce it's the end of our republic if Trump does it. And I'm not advocating for him to do it. I'm just saying it's not impossible.
Well, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome back to the Daily Signal podcast Cornell law professor Bill Jacobson, who also is the founder of Legal Insurrection. Professor Jacobson, thanks so much for being back with us.
Thank you for having me on.
Well, you all do such great work over at Legal Insurrection, and I was just looking at one of the recent pieces that you put out. It's titled Trump Third Term, Yes, He Could. You're a law professor. Break this down for us. What do you mean, yes, he could?
Some reporters, I think it was NBC News first, and then some others asked Trump, are you ruling out a third term? Okay, it's almost like red meat. And he said, no, I'm not ruling it out. Of course, then complete panic set in. But the answer is he can't run for president a third time. He can't be elected to the presidency a third time. That's very clear in the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution, very specific wording. But there's nothing in the Constitution that prohibits someone from serving a third term. Well, how could somebody serve a third term but not be elected to it? Well, the idea was floated last summer that perhaps Barack Obama would run for VP, either on the ticket with Biden or with somebody else. And if they won the election, he would not have been elected to a third time to the office of the presidency, which is what the Constitution speaks of. And then the president resigns and automatically the vice president becomes the president. Lo and behold, you have a third term. That was an idea floated, and a lot of lefty law professors who didn't want Trump to be the president thought that was a perfectly legitimate idea. And that is what people are speculating how it could be done. Whether it should be done is a totally different question. But the concept would be that Trump runs for vice president in 2028. Whoever is the president, they have a handshake deal that the president will resign, and then Trump assumes the presidency. He will not have been elected to the office of the president for 3 times. Therefore, it does not violate the Constitution. It might violate the spirit of the Constitution, but not the text of the Constitution. That's the concept.
So there's nothing in the Constitution that says once you've served in, the highest office in the land, you can't hold, a subsequent position. And I would think that there would be lots of legal challenges to something like this, but you're saying there wouldn't necessarily constitutionally be a ground to strike it down.
That's right. I don't think, you could make an argument. What was the intent of this provision? The intent of the provision is that we not have a permanent president, that there be term limits essentially for the president. There's another sentence in the 22nd Amendment which talks about if somebody assumes the presidency within the first 2 years of being vice president, that essentially counts as your first term. But if it's in the second half of your presidency, having, gotten there from vice president, you still can run 2 more times. And there was a lot of speculation. I remember when it was very clear to those of us who were honest that Joe Biden was not up to the task, that, what if he stepped down and Kamala assumed the presidency? Could she run for 2 more terms or just 1 more term? I remember that discussion. So there is another sentence which talks about what happens if you're the vice president and you become president. But again, those talk about, running for being elected to the office of the presidency. So it might be subject to challenge. It might be subject to what was the original meaning of these terms. But on its face, there's no barrier. And of course, the same law professors who said that was perfectly fine when Obama was going to do it will now announce it's the end of our republic if Trump does it. And I'm not advocating for him to do it. I'm just saying it's not impossible.
Interesting. What have you made of the response from the left corporate media, to Trump's comments? Because he's been, as he's been pressed, and everyone, like you said, they kind of want that red meat, so they've kind of been poking him with this. And he said, I think it was on March 31st, sitting in the Oval Office, he was like, well, I really haven't thought about it. He said, people have asked me to run a third term, but I haven't thought about it. I don't know.
Yeah, I think the media, I will say as a general observation, from what I'm seeing from high school and college friends on Facebook, which is really the only reason I'm there, people are really losing it. Okay, I think worse than Trump 1.0. Trump 1.0, there were bigger street protests, there was more street violence, things like that. Now you're just having, from what I can observe, an emotional breakdown. That they never thought this would happen. And so I think that the media is reacting the same way. They want to use this as an issue to undermine his current presidency. As you pointed out, it's not an issue he raised. Okay, they raised it with him, and he said, I'm not going to rule it out. And that's where we are. But the media loves this stuff. They want to focus on this. They want to focus on Elon Musk. They want to focus on all these extraneous issues. And so this is an extraneous issue that allows them to distract from a lot.
Well, one of the issues that you all do such a good job of covering at Legal Insurrection is what is happening across college campuses. And you all have a fantastic project called the Equal Protection Project that's really specifically looking into DEI initiatives on college campuses. This is an issue that recently Trump has been very, very clear on, telling colleges and universities, if you receive federal funding, you could lose that if you continue to push these DEI initiatives and offer DEI scholarships. Well, you all over at the Equal Protection Project, you all recently filed a federal complaint alleging that Pennsylvania College of Technology violated federal civil rights law because of a scholarship that they offer. Tell us about that, if you would.
Well, at Equal Protection Project, which is equalprotect.org, we launched in February 2023. So this was before the affirmative action ruling, before Trump's election, before the DEI executive orders. And we've challenged over 70 colleges and universities based on discriminatory programming and scholarships done in the name of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what we've challenged at Pennsylvania College of Technology, which is an affiliate of Penn State, are 12 scholarships that discriminate in their eligibility requirements, either based on race, color, national origin, or sex, and some of them both. And that's very common what we've seen. We have challenged over 200 different programs and scholarships at over 70 institutions. The concept of DEI plays itself out in discrimination. So we don't challenge something just because it's run by the DEI department. We challenge them where we believe there are civil rights violations. And having a scholarship or a program which says you can only apply if you are a certain race, a certain ethnicity, or a certain sex violates either Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, Title IX of the Civil Rights Act, and if you're a public institution, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, Equal Protection Guarantee. So that's what we filed against Pennsylvania College of Technology because they openly promote the scholarships. And they're not the worst offender we've seen. We challenged 51 scholarships at the University of Rhode Island, I think 40 some odd at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, Indiana University, I think we challenged 20 some odd. That is a little bit winding down in the sense that with Trump's executive orders, there's more at stake. There's funding that's at stake. And I think that will cause the colleges to hide what they're doing. I'm not sure it's going to cause them to stop what they're doing. But one thing we have definitely seen is that they're not publicizing it as much as they used to. And we've had very good results. In about half our cases, the university or the college changes the eligibility requirements. In a few cases, they've terminated the scholarship or the program, and that's not our goal. Our goal is not to close things down, it's to open them up. And we've been very, very successful at it.
In regard to these scholarship programs, where is the line? Because, obviously there are scholarships, just for men's sports teams to compete or just for women's sports teams. Or is it a really clear-cut line in the legal system to say, hey, you can offer a scholarship specifically for this group of people, but maybe, can't use this criteria?
Well, there's several levels to that. First off, the civil rights laws and the Constitution protect everybody. They don't just protect one race or one ethnicity or one sex. So everybody gets an equal start. There are some exceptions to that, and things like sports teams, supporting sports teams, that would be considered, I think, a legitimate state interest, although that's up for debate now. That's a hot issue.
Yeah.
But up until like 3 years ago, okay, it was considered legitimate, governmental interest, a legitimate public interest to have separate sports based on sex. In fact, a lot of people would say, and I would too, that that's actually required by Title IX. So there are some exceptions to it, but generally speaking, if it's a general scholarship not tied to a sports team, if it's a general program not tied to a sports team, you have to treat everybody equally unless you have a compelling state interest to not do so. And generally speaking, there's no compelling state interest. And I don't think there was any doubt, but if there was any doubt in the Supreme Court's affirmative action ruling, they found that the goal of diversity of the student body is not a sufficiently compelling state interest to justify racial discrimination. So every program we have challenged has clear eligibility requirements that discriminate on the basis of race, color, national origin, and or sex. So we're not actually been challenging DEI as such. That's a whole separate issue. We have been challenging programs and scholarships that violate the civil rights laws. Whether in the future we do what some groups have started to do, challenging programs just because they're DEI, is not something we've done, but Trump's new executive orders seem to open up that possibility, but that's not something we've done. So if you're in alignment with the civil rights laws and the Constitution, we're not going to challenge you, even if we don't like why you're doing this program or why you're doing this scholarship.
Yeah. Are conservatives winning on this front, both in the legal sense and in the court of public opinion? Because like you said, some of these schools are just kind of, seems like, getting better at hiding it.
That's a tough question. I've been a little bit of a pessimist on the likelihood that these executive orders will really get rid of DEI in higher education because it is so deeply embedded. As you know, because I've been on your program going back several years, and I appreciate that. We've been following this very closely, and we have been documenting through one of our projects, criticalrace.org, how deeply critical race theory in all its forms, and DEI is a form of critical race theory. DEI are the mechanisms by which critical race theory is implemented. So critical race theory is the theory, DEI are the action items that implement the theory. So we've been covering this for 5 years, and it's so deeply embedded. People have no idea how deeply embedded it is. The professors are on board. The administrators, more than anybody, are on board. Now, some of those departments are being eliminated in red states, but they're going strong in blue states. And so whether DEI can be squeezed out of the higher ed system remains to be seen. It's an analogy which may not be perfect, but I think it's pretty close, of trying to get soap out of a sponge. Okay, you squeeze it, and Trump is now squeezing that sponge, and a lot of the easy stuff is coming out now. And he's able to do that because he's eliminating the funding for a lot of these programs. And that's extraordinarily important. Defunding the DEI industrial complex is really important. Eliminating the positions at universities is really important. But the ideology survives. The people who advocate the ideology survive in the system. Most of them get shuffled to other positions in the university. So they may no longer be in the DEI department because the DEI department's been eliminated, but now they call it belonging. That's the new word. Now they call it something else. And they say, well, we're not doing DEI, so President Trump, please don't pull our funding. But they're doing it. And so it's going to be very tough. This did not happen overnight, although it accelerated post George Floyd, but it's been there for a long time. It's not going to go away in 2 or 3 years. And I don't mean to, minimize the significant impact that the Trump administration is having. They are, but it's going to be a long haul. Now that we're talking about third terms, a third term of Trump, so 8 years instead of 4 of defunding, of trying to squeeze that sponge, I think would have a long-term effect. Whether 1 to 3 years of it is going to be enough, I'm a little bit pessimistic on that, but you can only do what you can do. And, the Trump administration is doing what they can do.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if a next administration, if it is a conservative, carries some of these things forward. On that topic, though, one of the big actions that Trump recently announced was the dismantling of the Department of Education. Does that potentially play any role here, or is that kind of in a completely separate basket?
Well, again, a lot of the funding for the DEI industrial complex came through the federal departments, including the Department of Education. That's been terminated, so that's important. I'm not a lot of the mandates for what needed to be taught and how it needed to be taught, at least indirectly, came from the Department of Education. Those are being eliminated. So I think it will have an important effect. Whether slimming down the department to its core, whether he can completely get rid of it's a different question, but eliminating most of its functions, I'm not sure what impact that's going to have, because anybody who's been in the space, in the parents' rights space, knows that a lot of the worst actors in this area are at the state and local level. They're at the teachers union level. Teachers unions are the greatest malign force in the nation when it comes to DEI and the racialization of education. That's not going to go away in the short run. And that's why, again, I say a lot of what's happening is impactful, is important, but I don't think it's going to make it go away. And there are states where they're actually doubling down on critical race theory and DEI, like New York State. SUNY system, State University of New York system, which I think is 50 plus colleges and universities, now has a freshman, we're not allowed to say freshman anymore, has a first year requirement of essentially a DEI academic course. Okay, so it's getting worse in blue states. It's obviously gotten better in red states. Purple states could go either way. And I think what you're going to see is a huge academic and collegiate civil war where the country splits and you have a choice as a student. If you want to go to a school that's not completely infused from top to bottom with DEI, head south. Okay, if you want a school that's completely infused, no matter what happens at the federal level with DEI, go northeast and northwest and north central. So New York State, Illinois, California, Washington, Oregon, they're just going strong on this stuff. And students will make a choice. There's a lot of anecdotal talk. I don't know what the statistics show about students shunning the Ivy League and going to Southern schools. I think the University of Florida has established a program trying to entice the top-ranked students to come there. And I think there are other schools as well. It's not just University of Florida. And I think that's a good move. But students will have a choice. But DEI is going to persist for the foreseeable future. Give the nation this Trump term plus 2 Vance terms, or this Trump term plus a 3rd Trump term. Do this for 6 to 10 years, and I think you will deal mortal damage to DEI. Do it for 2 to 3 years, and they will hang on like survivors clinging to a lifeboat, just waiting for help to arrive. And the help could arrive in 2028, depending on who's elected president.
It's really interesting to hear you talk about that geographical split. That will be really fascinating if that is what plays out. That is really, really interesting. I do want to ask you one question related to dismantling the Department of Education, just from a legal perspective. Does Trump fully have that legal ability to restructure so many of the tasks of the Department of Education, put them in other departments? What is potentially kind of the legal fight that the president could be facing on that front?
Well, the challenges would be is if there are programs mandated by Congress that I think if they're mandated to be at the Department of Education, then they have to stay there. I don't know how many of those there are, but if they're simply mandated to be implemented by the federal government, there should be no impediment to moving student loans to a different department. Whether you could eliminate them is a different question. And I think that's where the fight's going to be. And the fight's going to be over cutting funding to these groups. And there's two issues there. One is cutting current funding, and that's what the fights are over, that there are contracts that the government has the right to terminate. And the challenges are, well, you're terminating it for the wrong reasons. Okay, but there's nothing on these contracts that are going to require them to be renewed. That's not even being fought now. That's why I say you need some time. But I think the Department of Education will continue in some capacity, maintaining those essential functions that Congress has mandated must be done by the executive branch. The one aspect that is going to be very interesting for us, because of the Equal Protection Project, most of the complaints we file have been through the Office for Civil Rights of the Department of Education. They fired about half their staff, but they're continuing to operating. Now, letting go half your staff doesn't mean that you're doing a worse job. I mean, look at Twitter now, X. They let go of like 70% of their employees, and they're doing just great. So that doesn't mean there'll be worse services. And so far, the OCR at the Department of Education has been fairly aggressive. They've opened several of our cases for investigation, including cases that had sat for months and months and months under the Biden administration. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Department, I think, is going to get more active. But a concern that we have, and I've expressed it publicly to the people in the Department of Justice and elsewhere, that if your goal as an administration is to enforce the civil rights laws and to get rid of what's sometimes called reverse discrimination, also called DEI discrimination, if that is your goal as an administration, you can't do it yourself. You need to maintain a mechanism for groups like ours and the public to be able to bring things to your attention, and you need an enforcement mechanism. It's a little too soon to tell how this is going to play out. I do know Department of Justice is getting more involved in civil rights matters. They just opened a major investigation, publicly announced, into a case that we brought against the Providence Public School District for a discriminatory program. So I'm not sure what the future is going to look like, but my message to the administration, if you're listening and watching, is that you can't achieve your goals of ending DEI discrimination and also eliminate the administrative remedies that allow the public to file complaints and bring these things to your attention. Because if you're going to be cutting back staff to save money, you need the public, you need groups like mine and many other groups to be able to document, evaluate, and bring these things to your attention. So I hope that they don't completely eliminate OCR at Department of Education, but if they do, and this has been talked about, they're talking about rolling it into an equivalent function at the Department of Justice. But there needs to be a mechanism for groups like mine and the public to bring to your attention, because we're the eyes and ears on the ground. I mean, at my websites, we get tips pretty much every day from people who say, are you aware of this program? Are you aware of this scholarship? And they do that through our contact form. And we need that. And the government enforcement of civil rights laws needs that. You're never going to have enough people in the Department of Justice or Education to do all the things that the public can do and that groups like ours can do. So please maintain this function because it's critical to achieving what you have said is your mission of eliminating DEI discrimination.
Well, and that really whistleblowing in so many ways that you guys are doing, the holding accountable is critical. If individuals who are listening or watching want to send you guys some information, say, hey, I want to make sure you're aware of this scholarship program or whatnot, how can they do that? And in general, how can folks follow your work at the Equal Protection Project and at Legal Insurrection?
So Equal Protection Project, equalprotect.org, we have a contact form there. And that's probably the easiest way to reach us. Through that contact form. It goes right, sends us a message right away. We also have contact forms at criticalrace.org and at our foundation website, which is legalinsurrectionfoundation.org. Any of those ways. And visiting those websites is the best way to keep up with what we're doing. We encourage people to come by and see all we're doing. And we appreciate that you've given me an opportunity to tell people what we do.
Absolutely. Professor Jacobson, as always, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Subscribe to get the news the legacy media won't tell you and only the Daily Signal can bring to you.